St. John's Eve by Nikolai Vasilevich Gogol. Thoma Grigorovich had a very strange sort of eccentricity. To the day of his death, he never liked to tell the same thing twice. There were times when, if you asked him to relate a thing afresh, behold, he would interpolate new matter or alter it so that it was impossible to recognize it. Once on a time, one of those gentlemen, it's hard for us simple people to put a name to them, to say whether they are scribblers or not scribblers, but it is just the same thing as the usurers at our yearly fairs. They clutch and beg and steal every sort of frippery and issue mean little volumes no thicker than an ABC book every month or even every week. One of these gentlemen wormed this same story out of Thoma Grigorovich. I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it. And he completely forgot about it. But that same young gentleman in the pea green captain, whom I have mentioned, and one of those tales you have already read, I think, came from Poltava, bringing with him a little book and opening it in the middle, showed it to us. Thoma Grigorovich was on the point of setting his spectacles astride of his nose, but recollected that he had forgotten to wind thread about them and stick them together with wax, so he passed it over to me. As I understand something about reading and writing, and do not wear spectacles, I undertook to read it. I had not turned 2 leaves, when all at once he caught me by the hand and stopped me. Stop. Tell me first what you were reading. I confess that I was a trifle stunned by such a question. What am I reading, Thoma Grigorovich? These were your very words. Who told you that they were my words? Why, what more would you have? Here it is printed, related by such and such a sacristan. Spit on the head of the man who printed that. He lies. The dog of a Moscow peddler. Did I say that? 'Twas just the same as though one hadn't his wits about him. Listen, I'll tell it to you on the spot. We moved up to the table, and he began. My grandfather, the kingdom of heaven be his, may he eat only wheaten rolls and makavneka, poppy seeds cooked in honey and dried in square cakes, with honey in the other world. Could tell a story wonderfully well. He used to begin on a tale. He wouldn't stir from the spot all day, but keep on listening. He was no match for the storyteller of the present day. When he begins to lie with a tongue as though he had nothing to eat for 3 days, so that you could snatch your cap and flee from the house. As I now recall it, my old mother was alive then, and the long winter evenings when the frost was crackling out of doors and had so sealed up hermetically the narrow panes of our cottage, she used to sit before the hackling comb, drawing out a long thread in her hand, rocking the cradle with her foot, and humming a song which I seem to hear even now. The fat lamp, quivering and flaring up as though in fear of something, lighted us within our cottage. The spindle hummed, and all of us children collected in a cluster, listened to grandfather, who had not crawled off the stove for more than 5 years, owing to his great age, but the wondrous tales of the incursions of the Zaporogian Cossacks, the Poles, the bold deeds of Podkova, Polter, Kozuk, and Saga Edachny did not interest us so much as the stories about some deed of old, which always sent a shiver through our frames and made our hair rise upright on our necks. Sometimes such terror took possession of us in consequence of them that, from that evening on, heaven knows what a marvel everything seemed to us. If you chanced to go out of the cottage after nightfall for anything, you imagined that a visitor from the other world has lain down to sleep in your bed, and I should not be able to tell this a second time, were it not that I had often taken my own smock at a distance as it lay in the head of the bed, for the evil one rolled up in a ball. But the chief thing about the grandfather's stories was that he never lied in his life, and whatever he said was so. Well, imagination is definitely part of the evil magic process. And the evil one would definitely encourage unnecessary lies. And no, I don't include, well, to tell a story and to twist things. That's not a necessary lie. I will now relate to you one of his marvelous tales. I know that there are a great many wise people who copy in the courts and can even read civil documents, who, if you were to put into their hand a simple prayer book, could not make out the first letter in it, and would show all their teeth in derision, which is wisdom. These people laugh at everything you tell them. Such incredulity has spread abroad in the world. What then? Why may God and the Holy Virgin cease to love me if it is not possible that even you will not believe me? Once he said something about witches. What then? Along comes one of these head breakers and doesn't believe in witches. Yes, glory to God that I have lived so long in the world. I've seen heretics to whom it would be easier to lie in confession than it would for our brothers and equals to take snuff. And those people would deny the existence of witches. But let them just dream about something, and they won't even tell what it was. There's no use in talking about them. And very often, it's a certain sort of belief that makes people more vulnerable to the witchcraft. And by witchcraft, I don't mean Wicca or something. I mean actually working with the demons. No one could have recognized this village of ours a little over 100 years ago. A hamlet it was, the poorest kind of hamlet. Half a score of miserable ismas, unplastered, badly thatched, were scattered here and there about the fields. There was not an enclosure or a decent shed to shelter animals or wagons. That was the way the wealthy lived. And if you had looked for our brothers, the poor, why, a hole in the ground, that was a cabin for you. Only by the smoke could you tell that a God-created man lived there. You ask why they lived so. It was not entirely through poverty. Almost everyone led a wandering Cossack life and gathered not a little plunder in foreign lands. It was rather because there was no reason for setting up a well-ordered kata wooden house. How many people were wandering all over the country? Crimeans, Poles, Lithuanians. It was quite possible that their own countrymen might make a descent and plunder everything. Anything was possible. In this hamlet, a man, or rather a devil in human form, often made his appearance. Why he came and whence, no one knew. He prowled about, got drunk, and suddenly disappeared, as if into the air, and there was not a hint of his existence. Then again, behold, and he seemed to have dropped from the sky, and went flying about the street of the village, of which no trace now remains, and which was not more than 100 paces from Ikunka. He would collect together all the Cossacks he met. Then there were songs, laughter, money in abundance, and vodka flowed like water. He would address the pretty girls and give them ribbons, earrings, strings of beads, more than they knew what to do with. It is true that the pretty girls rather hesitated about accepting his presents. God knows, perhaps they'd pass through unclean hands. My grandfather's aunt, who kept a tavern at the time, in which Vasilevich, as they called that devil man, often had his carouses, said that no consideration on the face of earth would have induced her to accept a gift from him. And then again, how avoid accepting? Fear seized on everyone when he knit his bristly brows and gave a sidelong glance which might send your feet God knows whither. But if you accept, then next night, some fiend from the swamp with horns on his head, so he was a vegetarian, huh, comes to call and begins to squeeze your neck when there is a string of beads upon it, or drag you by the hair if ribbons are braided in it. God have mercy then on those who own such gifts. But here was the difficulty. It was impossible to get rid of them. If you threw them into the water, the diabolical ring or necklace would skim along the surface and into your hand. There was a church in the village, St. Pantelei, if I remember rightly. There lived a priest, Father Athanasi, of blessed memory. Observing that Vasilevich did not come to church, even on Easter, he determined to reprove him and impose penance upon him. Well, he hardly escaped with his life. Hark ye, Panache, sir, he thundered in reply. Learn to mind your own business instead of meddling in other people's. If you don't want that goat's throat of yours stuck together with boiling kutcha, a dish of rice or wheat flour with honey and raisins, which is brought to the church on the celebration of memorial masses. What was to be done with this unrepentant man? Father Athanasi contented himself with announcing that anyone who should make the acquaintance of Vasilevich would be counted a Catholic, an enemy of Christ's church, not a member of the human race. In this village, there was a Cossack named Korz, who had a laborer, whom people called Peter the Orphan, perhaps because no one remembered either his father or mother. The church, Staros, Pillar, it is true, said that they had died of the pest in his second year. But my grandfather's aunt would not hear of that, and tried with all her might to furnish him with parents, although poor Peter needed them about as much as we need last year's snow. She said that his father had been in Zaporozhye, taken prisoner by the Turks, underwent God only knows what tortures, and having by some miracle disguised himself as a eunuch, had made his escape. Now, the Turks are mostly Muslim, and they would have known that torture was not an acceptable thing for prisoners or others. Little cared the black-browed youths and maidens about his parents. They merely remarked that if only he had a new coat, a red sash, a black lambskin cap with dandified blue crown on his head, a Turkish saber hanging by his side, a whip in one hand, and a pipe with handsome mountings in the other, he would surpass all the young men. But the pity was that the only thing poor Peter had was a gray svitka with more holes in it than there are gold pieces in a Jew's pocket. And that was not the worst of it, but this, that Korz had a daughter, such a beauty as I think you can hardly have chanced to see. Now we know now that most Jews are poor. My deceased grandfather's aunt used to say, and you know that it is easier for a woman to kiss the evil one than to call anybody a beauty. Without malice, be it said that this Cossack maiden's cheeks were as plump and fresh as the pinkest poppy when just bathed in God's dew, and glowing it unfolds its petals and coquettes with the rising sun, that her brows were like black cords, such as our maidens buy nowadays for their crosses and ducats. The Moscow peddlers who visit the villages with their baskets, and evenly arched as though peeping into her clear eyes, that her little mouth, at sight of which the youth smacked their lips, seemed made to emit the songs of nightingales, that her hair, black as the raven's wing, and soft as young flax. Our maidens did not then plait their hair in clubs interwoven with pretty, bright-hued ribbons, fell in curls over her tuntush, upper garment in Little Russia. May I never intone another Alleluia in the choir, if I would not have kissed her, in spite of the gray, which is making its way all through the old wool which covers my pate, and my old woman beside me, like a thorn in my side. Well, you know what happens when young men and maids live side by side. In the twilight, the heels of red boots are always visible in the place where Fedorka chatted with her Petros. But Korza would never have suspected anything out of the way. Only one day it is evident that none but the evil one could have inspired him. Petrus took it into his head to kiss the Cossack maiden's rosy lips with all his heart in the passage, without first looking well about him. And that same evil one made the son of a dog dream of the Holy Cross, caused the old graybeard like a fool to open the cottage door at the same moment. Korza was petrified, dropped his jaw, and clutched at the door for support. Those unlucky kisses had completely stunned him. It surprised him more than the blow of a pestle on the wall, with which, in our days, the muzhik generally drives out his intoxication or lack of fusses and powder. Fuses and powder. Recovering himself, he took his grandfather's hunting whip from the wall and was about to belabor Peter's back with it, when Fedorka's little 6-year-old brother, Ivas, rushed up from somewhere or other, and, grasping his father's legs with his little hands, screamed out, "Daddy, Daddy, don't beat Petros." What was to be done? A father's heart is not made of stone, hanging the whip again upon the wall, he led him quietly from the house. If you ever show yourself in my cottage again, or even under the windows, look out, Petro. By heaven, your black mustache will disappear, and your black locks, even though wound twice about your ears, will take leave of your pate, or my name is not Terenti Kors. So, saying, he gave him a little taste of his fist in the nape of his neck, so that all grew dark before Petros, and he flew headlong, so there was an end of their kissing. Sorrow seized upon our doves, and a rumor was rife in the village that a certain Pole, all embroidered with gold, with mustaches, sabers, spurs, and pockets jingling like the bells of the bag with which our sacristan Taurus goes through the church every day, had begun to frequent Cor's house. Now it is well known why the father is visited when there is a black-browed daughter about. So, one day, Pedorka burst into tears and clutched the hand of her Ivis. Ivis, my dear, Ivis, my love, lie to Petrus, my child of gold, like an arrow from a bow. Tell him all. I would have loved his brown eyes. I would have kissed his white face. But my fate decrees not so. More than one towel have I wet with burning tears. I am sad. I am heavy at heart, and my own father is my enemy. I will not marry that Pole, whom I do not love. Tell him they are preparing a wedding, but there will be no music at our wedding. Ecclesiastics will sing instead of pipes, and Kobza's 8-stringed musical instrument. I shall not dance with my bridegroom. They will carry me out. Dark, dark will be my dwelling, of maple wood, and instead of chimneys, a cross will stand upon the roof. And one of the things is that there's a lot of thing about musical instruments being of the devil, and certainly a lot of uses. It is certainly better to have a wedding where you recite scripture, or somebody does, or something. Petro stood petrified, without moving from the spot, when the innocent child lisped out Pedorka's works to him, and I, unhappy man, thought to go to the Crimea and Turkey, win gold, and return to thee, my beauty. But it may not be. The evil eye has seen us. I will have a wedding too, dear little fish. I too, but no ecclesiastics, will be at that wedding. The black crow will caw instead of the Pope. Over me the smooth field will be my dwelling, the dark blue clouds my roof tree. The eagle will claw out my brown eyes. The rain will wash the Cossack's bones, and the whirlwinds will dry them. But what am I? Of whom to whom am I complaining? 'Tis plain, God willed it so. If I am to be lost, then so be it. And he went straight to the tavern. My late grandfather's aunt was somewhat surprised on seeing Petrus in the tavern, and at an hour when good men go to morning mass, and she started at him as though through a dream when he demanded a jug of brandy, about half a pailful. So they have mass at sunrise rather than like the biblical prayer of dawn, or most religious traditions, the prayers at dawn. I don't remember the Catholic schedule. I don't think it's according to, the modern 12 is always, when the day starts, or, a good brandy, about half a pailful. But the poor fellow tried in vain to drown his woe. The vodka stung his tongue like nettles and tasted more bitter than wormwood. Well, if wormwood has a chance to rot and stuff like that, like people soaking it in booze, it's always, I hear there's different experience, taste-wise and otherwise, of the liquor soaked in it. He flung the jug from him upon the ground. You have sorrowed enough, Cossack, growled a bass voice behind him. He looked round. Vasilevich. Ah, what a face! His hair was like a brush, his eyes like those of a bull. I know what you lack. Here it is. Then he jingled a leather purse which hung from his girdle, and smiled diabolically. Petro shuddered. He, yes, how it shines, he roared, shaking out ducats into his hand. He, and how it jingles. And I only ask one thing, for a whole pile of such shiners. It is the evil one, exclaimed Petro. Give them here. I'm ready for anything. They struck hands upon it. See here, Petro, you are ripe just in time. Tomorrow is St. John the Baptist's day. Only on this one night in the year does the fern blossom. Delay not. I will await thee at midnight in the Bear's Ravine. Well, ferns are still blossoming here, so I don't know. I do not believe that chickens await the hour when the woman brings their corn with as much anxiety as Petrus awaited the evening. And in fact, he looked to see whether the shadows of the trees were not lengthening, if the sun were not turning red toward setting. And the longer he watched, the more impatient he grew. How long it was! Evidently, God's day had lost its end somewhere. And now the sun is gone. The sky is red only on one side, and it is already growing dark. It grows colder in the fields. It gets dusky and more dusky, and at last quite dark. At last. With heart almost bursting from his bosom, he set out on his way and cautiously descended through the dense woods into the deep hollow called the Bear's Ravine. Vasilevich was already waiting there. It was so dark that you could not see a yard before you. Hand in hand, they penetrated the thin marsh, clinging to the luxuriant thorn bushes and stumbling at almost every step. At last, they reached an open spot. Petro looked about him. He had never chanced to come there before. Here, Vasilevich halted. Do you see before you stand 3 hillocks? There are a great many sorts of flowers upon them, but may some power keep you from plucking even one of them. But as soon as the fern blossoms, seize it and look not round, no matter what may seem to be going on behind thee. Petro wanted to ask, and behold, he was no longer there. He approached 3 hillocks. Where were the flowers? He saw nothing. The wild steppe grass darkled around and stifled everything in its luxuriance. But the lightning flashed, and before him stood a whole bed of flowers, all wonderful, all strange, and there were also the simple fronds of fern. Petro doubted his senses and stood thoughtfully before them, with both hands upon his sides. What prodigy is this? One can see these weeds 10 times in a day. What marvel is there about them? Was not devil's face laughing at me? Behold, the tiny flower bud crimsons and moves as though alive. It is a marvel, in truth. It moves and grows larger and larger and flashes like a burning coal. The tiny star flashes up, something bursts softly, and the flower opens before his eyes like a flame, lighting the others about it. Now is the time, thought Petro, and extended his hand. He sees hundreds of shaggy hands reach from behind him, also for the flower. There is a running about from place to place in the rear. He half shut his eyes, plucked sharply at the stalk, and the flower remained in his hand. All became still upon a stump set Vasilevich, all blue, like a corpse. He moved not so much as a finger. His eyes were immovably fixed on something visible to him alone. His mouth was half open and speechless. All about, nothing stirred. Ah, it was horrible. But then a whistle was heard, which made Petro's heart grow cold within him. And it seemed to him that the grass whispered, and the flowers began to talk among themselves in delicate voices like little silver bells. The trees rustled in waving contention. Vasilevich's face suddenly became full of life, and his eyes sparkled. The witch has just returned, he muttered between his teeth. See here, Petro, a beauty will stand before you in a moment. Do whatever she commands. If not, you are lost forever. Usually really bad advice, but then he parted the thorn bush with a knotty stick, and before him stood a tiny izba on chicken's legs, as they say. Vasilevich smote it with his fist, and the wall trembled. A large black dog ran out to meet them, and with the wine transforming itself into a cat, flew straight at his eyes. Don't be angry, you old Satan, said Vasilevich, employing such words as would have made a good man stop his ears. Behold, instead of a cat, an old woman with a face wrinkled like a baked apple, and all bent into a beauty, thought Petro. Oh, all bent into a bow. Her nose and chin were like a pair of nutcrackers. A stunning beauty, thought Petro, and cold chills ran down his back. The witch tore the flower from his hand, bent over, and muttered over it for a long time, sprinkling it with some kind of water. Sparks flew from her mouth. Froth appeared on her lips. Throw it away, she said, giving it back to Petro. Petro threw it, and what wonder was this? The flower did not fall straight to the earth, but for a long while twinkled like a fairy ball through the darkness and swam through the air like a boat. At last it began to sink lower and fell so far away that the little star, hardly larger than a poppy seed, was barely visible. Here croaked the old woman in a dull voice, and Vasilevich, giving him a spade, said, Dig here, Petro. Here you will find more gold than you or Course ever dreamed of. Petro spat on his hands, seized the spade, and applied his foot, and turned up the earth a second, a third, a fourth time. There was something hard. The spade clinked and would go no further. Then his eyes began to distinguish a small, iron-bound coffer. He tried to seize it, but the chest began to sink into the earth, deeper, farther, and deeper still. And behind him he heard a laugh, more like a serpent's hiss. No, you shall not see the gold until you procure human blood, said the witch, and led up to him a child of 6, covered with a white sheet, indicating by a sign that he was to cut off his head. Petro was stunned. A trifle indeed to cut off a man's, or even an innocent child's, head, for no reason whatever. In wrath he tore off the sheet, enveloping his head, and behold, before him stood Ivas, and the poor child crossed his little hands and hung his head. Petro flew upon the witch with the knife like a madman, and was on the point of laying hands on her. What did you promise for the girl? Thundered Vasilevich. And like a shot, he was on his back. The witch stamped her foot. A blue flame flashed from the earth. It illumined it all inside, and it was as if molded of crystal. and all that was within the earth became visible, as if in the palm of the hand. Took its precious stones in chests and kettles, were piled in heaps beneath the very spot they stood on. His eyes burned, his mind grew troubled. He grasped the knife like a madman, and the innocent blood spurted into his eyes. Diabolical laughter resounded on all sides. Misshaped monsters flew past him in herds. The witch, fastening her hands in the headless trunk like a wolf, drank its blood. All went round in his head. Collecting all his strength, he set out to run. Everything turned red before him. The trees seemed steeped in blood and burned and groaned. The sky glowed and glowed. Burning points, like lightning, Lord, flicked before his eyes. Utterly exhausted, he rushed into his miserable hovel and fell to the ground like a log. A death-like sleep overpowered him. 2 days and 2 nights did Petro sleep, without once awakening. When he came to himself on the 3rd day, he looked long at all the corners of his hut, but in vain did he endeavor to recollect. His memory was like a miser's pocket, from which you cannot entice a quarter of a kopeck. Stretching himself, he heard something clash at his feet. He looked. 2 bags of gold. Then, only as if in a dream, he recollected that he had been seeking some treasure, that something had frightened him in the woods, but at what price had he obtained it, and how? He could by no means understand. Chorus saw the sacks, and was mollified. Such a Petrus, quite unheard of. Yes, and did I not love him? Was he not to me as my own son? And the old fellow carried on his fiction until it reduced him to tears. Pedorka began to tell him some passing gypsies had stolen Evas, but Petro could not even recall him. To such a degree had the devil's influence darkened his mind. There was no reason for delay. The Pole was dismissed, and the wedding feast prepared. Rolls were baked, towels and handkerchiefs embroidered. The young people were seated at table. The wedding loaf was cut. Banderas, cymbals, pipes, kobzi sounded, and pleasure was rife. A wedding in the olden times was not like one of the present day. My grandfather's aunt used to tell. What doings, how the maidens in festive headdresses of gold, blue, and pink ribbons, above which they bound gold braid in thin chemisettes embroidered on all the seams with red silk, and strewn with tiny silver flowers, in Morocco shoes with high iron heels, danced the Gorlitza as swimmingly as peacocks and as wildly as the whirlwind. How the youths, with their ship-shaped caps upon their heads, the crowns of gold brocade, with a little slit at the nape where the hairnet peeped through, and 2 horns projecting, one in front and another behind, of the very finest black lambskin, in contusias of the finest blue silk, with red borders, stepped forward one by one, their arms akimbo, in stately form, and executed the gopak. How the lads, in tall Cossack caps, and light cloth svitkas, girt with silver embroidered belts, their short pipes in their teeth, skipped before them and talked nonsense. Even Kortz could not contain himself, as he gazed at the young people, from getting joyous in his old age, bandura in hand, alternately puffing at his pipe and singing, a brandy glass upon his head. The graybeard began the national dance amid the loud shouts from the merrymakers. What will not people devise in merry mood? They even began to disguise their faces. They did not look like human beings. They are not to be compared with the disguises which we have at our weddings nowadays. What do they do now? Why imitate gypsies and Moscow peddlers? No. Then one used to dress himself as a Jew, another as the devil. They would begin by kissing each other and end by seizing each other by the hair. God be with them. You laughed till you held your sides. They dressed themselves in Turkish and Tartar garments. All upon them glowed like a conflagration. And then they began to joke and play pranks. Well, then away with the saints. An amusing thing happened to my grandfather's aunt, who was at this wedding. She was dressed in a voluminous Tartar robe, and wine glass in hand, was entertaining the company. The evil one instigated one man to pour vodka over her from behind. Another, at the same moment, evidently not by accident, struck a light and touched it to her. The flame flashed up. Poor aunt, in terror, flung her robe from her. Before them all, screams, laughter, jests arose, as if at a fair. In a word, the old folks could not recall so merry a wedding. Well, not for that woman. Pidorka and Petrus began to live like a gentleman and lady. There was plenty of everything, and everything was handsome. But honest people shook their heads when they looked at their way of living. From the devil, no good can come, they unanimously agreed. Whence, except from the tempter of orthodox people, came this wealth? Where else could he get such a lot of gold? Why, on the very day that he got rich, did Vasilevich vanish, as if into thin air. Say if you can that people imagine things. In fact, a month had not passed, and no one would have recognized Petrus. Why, what had happened to him, God knows. He sits in one spot and says no word to anyone. He thinks continually and seems to be trying to recall something. When Pidorka succeeds in getting him to speak, he seems to forget himself, carries on a conversation, and even grows cheerful. But if he inadvertently glances at the sacks, stop, stop, I have forgotten, he cries, and again plunges into reverie, and again strives to recall something. Sometimes, when he has sat long in a place, it seems to him as though it was coming, just coming back to mind, and again all fades away. It seems as if he is sitting in the tavern. They bring him vodka. Vodka stings him. Vodka is repulsive to him. Someone comes along and strikes him on the shoulder. But beyond that, everything is veiled in darkness before him. The perspiration streams down his face, and he sits exhausted in the same place. What did not Pidorka do? She consulted the sorceress, and they poured out fear and brewed stomachache. To pour out fear is done with us in case of fear, when it is desired to know what caused it. Melted lead or wax is poured into water, and the object whose form it assumes is the one which frightened the sick person. After this, the fear departs. Son Yashnitsa is brewed for giddiness and pain in the bowels. Well, if there's something going on internally, drinking is not going to help either. But I mean, alcoholic beverages. To this end, a bit of stump is burned, thrown into a jug, and turned upside down into a bowl filled with water, which is placed on the patient's stomach. After an incantation, he is given a spoonful of this water to drink, but all to no avail. Well, whatever your spirituality is, it's good to include that in your healing processes. And so the summer passed. Many a Cossack had mowed and reaped. Many a Cossack, more enterprising than the rest, had set off upon an expedition. Flocks of ducks were already crowding our marshes. But there was not even a hint of improvement. It was red upon the steppes. Ricks of grain like Cossacks' caps dotted the fields here and there. On the highway were to be encountered wagons loaded with brushwood and logs. The ground had become more solid, and in places was touched with frost. Already the snow began to sprinkle the sky, and the branches of the trees were covered with rime like rabbit skin. Already on frosty days, the red-breasted finch hopped about on the snow heaps like a foppish Polish nobleman, and picked out grains of corn, and children with huge sticks chased wooden tops upon the ice, while their fathers lay quietly on the stove. Issuing forth at intervals with lighted pipes in their lips, to growl in regular fashion at the orthodox frost, are to take the air and thresh the grain spread out in the barn. At last the snow began to melt, and the ice rind slipped away, but Petro remained the same, and the longer it went on, the more morose he grew. He sat in the middle of the cottage, as though nailed to the spot, with the sacks of gold at his feet. He grew shy, his hair grew long, he became terrible, and still he thought of but one thing. Still he tried to recall something, and got angry and ill-tempered because he could not recall it. Often, rising wildly from his seat, he gesticulates violently, fixes his eyes on something as though desirous of catching it, his lips move as though desirous of uttering some long-forgotten word, and remains speechless. Fury takes possession of him. He gnaws and bites his hands like a man half crazy, and in his vexation tears out his hair by the handful, until, calming down, he falls into forgetfulness, as it were, and again begins to recall, and is again seized with fury and fresh tortures. What visitation of God is this? Now, one could say that the mind will reorganize stuff like having to sell your children because of poverty or whatever the deal was. Fedorka was neither dead nor alive. At first it was horrible to her to remain alone in the cottage, but in course of time the poor woman grew accustomed to her sorrow. But it was impossible to recognize Fedorka of former days. No blush, no smile, she was thin and warm with grief, and had wept her bright eyes away. Once someone who evidently took pity on her advised her to go to the witch who dwelt in the Bear's Ravine and enjoyed the reputation of being able to cure every disease in the world. Well, we also see the ability to cause illusion and delusion, so you don't know whether you're doing something good or bad or harmful or beneficial or whatever. She determined to try this last remedy. Word by word, she persuaded the old woman to come to her. This was St. John's Eve, as it chanced. Petro lay insensible on the bench and did not observe the newcomer. Little by little, he rose and looked about him. Suddenly, he trembled in every limb, as though he were on the scaffold. His hair rose upon his head, and he laughed such a laugh as pierced Fedorka's heart with fear. I have remembered, he cried in terrible joy, and swinging a hatchet round his head, he flung it at the old woman with all his might. The hatchet penetrated the oaken doors to 2 vershok, 3 inches and a half. The old woman disappeared, and a child of 7, in a white blouse, with covered head, stood in the middle of the cottage. The sheet flew off. "Ivas!" cried Fedorka, and ran to him, but the apparition became covered from head to foot with blood, and illumined the whole room with red light. She ran into the passage in her terror, but on the recovering herself a little, wished to help him in vain. The door had slammed behind her so securely that she could not open it. People ran up and began to knock. They broke in the door as though there were but one mind among them. The whole cottage was full of smoke, and just in the middle where Petrus had stood was a heap of ashes, from which smoke was still rising. They flung themselves upon the sacks. Only broken potsherds lay there instead of ducats. The Cossacks stood with staring eyes and open mouths, not daring to move a hair, as if rooted to the earth. Such terror did this wonder inspire in them. I do not remember what happened next. Fedorka took a vow to go on pilgrimage, collected the property left her by her father, and in a few days it was as if she had never been in the village. Whether she had gone, no one could tell. Officious old women would have dispatched her to the same place where Petro had gone, but a Cossack from Kiev reported that he had seen in a cloister a nun withered to a mere skeleton who prayed unceasingly, and her fellow villagers recognized her as Fedorka by all the signs, that no one had ever heard her utter a word, that she had come on foot and had brought a frame for the icon of God's mother, set with such brilliant stones that all were dazzled at the sight. But this was not the end, if you please. On the same day that the evil one made away with Petrus, Vasilevich appeared again, but all fled from him. They knew what sort of bird he was, none else than Satan, who had assumed human form in order to unearth treasures, and since treasures do not yield to unclean hands, well, gospel prosperity stuff ain't true, but he seduced the young. That same year, all deserted their earth huts and collected in a village, but even there was no peace on account of that accursed Vasilevich. My late grandfather's aunt said that he was particularly angry with her because she had abandoned her former tavern and tried with all his might to revenge himself upon her. Once the village elders were assembled in the tavern, and as the saying goes, were arranged in the precedence at the table, in the middle of which was placed a small roasted lamb. Shame to say, they chattered about this, that, and the other, among the rest, about various marvels and strange things. Well, they saw something. It would have been nothing if only one had seen it, but all saw it, and it was this. The sheep raised his head. His goggling eyes became alive and sparkled, and the black bristling mustache, which appeared for one instant, made a significant gesture at those present, all at once recognized Vasiliev's countenance. In the sheep's head, my grandfather's aunt thought it was on the point of asking for vodka. The worthy elders seized their hats and hastened home. Another time, the church, Strost himself, who was fond of an occasional private interview with my grandfather's brandy glass, had not succeeded in getting to the bottom twice. When he beheld the glass, bowing very low to him, Satan take you. Let us make the sign of the cross over you. And at the same marvel happened to his better half. She had just begun to mix the dough in a huge kneading trough, when suddenly the trough sprang up. Stop, stop. Where are you going? Putting its arms akimbo, with dignity it went skipping all about the cottage. You may laugh, but it was no laughing matter to your grandfathers. And in vain did Father Athanasi go through all the village with holy water and chase the devil through the streets with his brush. And my late grandfather's aunt long complained that, as soon as it was dark, someone came knocking at her door and scratching at the wall. Well, all appears to be quiet now in the place where our village stands, but it was not so very long ago. my father was still alive, that I remember how a good man could not pass the ruined tavern, which a dishonest race had long managed for their own interest. From smoke-blackened chimneys, smoke poured out in a pillar, and rising high in the air as if to take an observation, rolled off like a cap, scattering burning coals over the step, and Satan, the son of a dog, should not be mentioned, sobbed so pitifully in his lair that the startled ravens rose in flocks from the neighboring oak wood and flew through the air with wild cries. And sometimes we are seeing the breaking down of sensibilities, but it's more about that the demons want a person to obey them along the thing, to follow their narrative. They may make it look like you're doing something to exalt your spirits or to tear down some or test some attachment or whatever that you have. Much like some of the Jews talk about, because they believe that Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, Isaac, and it didn't work. And so his whole life, he was like, he already killed him in his head or something like that. I didn't articulate that too well, but you know what I mean.